Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of the LCC legal track. This panel will be on the DeFi, TradFi, same risk, same regulation. So we will mainly talk about DeFi and if DeFi should be regulated, how it could be regulated, what is the right level of regulation, and so on. We are pleased to welcome. Maybe I will let you introduce yourself because. It will be welcome. So we welcome James Burnie, Rettig, and Collins Belton. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm James Burnie. I'm a partner at law firm Gunnar Cook.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Rettig. I'm the general counsel of the Aave companies.
Hey, I'm Collins Belton. I'm managing partner at Brookwood PC.
Okay, thank you for this introduction. So I'm William O'Rourke from our law firm, and I will moderate this panel. So maybe let's start by the basic for the people who will listen this panel and that maybe not so like fluent with the DeFi. Maybe could you introduce what DeFi is in a simple way, Rebecca, if you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So the way I explain DeFi, or decentralized finance, is that it is an economic system where users can engage in different types of transactions without the need for intermediaries, and all transactions are facilitated by technology. I don't know if you want to fix that in any way.
You want to add something?
No, if you want to put it in idiot terms, it's basically people who haven't watched Star Wars. Star Wars, many galaxies. DeFi is only on Earth, is only of those people involved in crypto, and it's only about blockchain. So there's an element of centralization in everything. But the thing about DeFi is whether if you make it across multiple participants rather than a single participant, how that might change the existing centralized structure. So don't sort of go for the puritanical, it is everywhere, it can't be touched stuff, because Star Wars shows that isn't true. Go for the sort of, it's across multiple jurisdictions, across multiple players, and they're becoming more complicated. That's nearer where DeFi is at.
Okay, Colin, you want to add something? Perfect. So yeah, we can understand DeFi as it's a bunch of financial services, actually quite similar from the what the traditional financial services are offering, but without intermediaries. It's mainly or exclusively non-custodial, obviously, and it's a finance made for the crypto asset and with the technology, the underlying technology or the technology of the crypto asset. Okay, very interesting. So, could you give us maybe some figures about the DeFi, how big it is, and what is maybe the main activity? Because I think it will be interesting to jump into the regulation part of this panel after all. Colin, maybe?
So it's hard to, I guess, talk about precise figures. Obviously, we could talk about like TVL or total value locked. I don't know if that's always the best metric, but I think, at its height, probably in 2021, we were looking at something like 100 to 150 billion TVL across some of the larger protocols, obviously bigger than a couple of like small countries' GDPs. But even now, I think, even at the height of this kind of bear market, or hopefully the height of this bear market, we're still looking at some of the protocols. I think Aave is still at, 10 to 15 billion plus. So it's still pretty significant. In terms of, I think you said figures, and then,
I mean, it's 1.5% of the size of it. Actually, though, is 1.5% of the U.S. equity markets. I think in terms
really?
of I've heard that it's going around a lot. And no, all I was saying is numbers-wise, whatever it may be today, is that it's about 1.5 to 2% of the size of the U.S. equity markets, which is very interesting because since we're going to get to talk about regulation, and I've actually just thought about this a lot lately because I do a lot of work on regulation, is I've never, for something so small that has no real systemic risk yet and can't affect things in such a way yet, there is such an interest in regulating this new technology that it's pretty wild.
Yeah, maybe because also, all the crypto industry is raising a lot of interest. It's new. It's maybe the new trend, and it's magical. Maybe if you don't understand how it works. Okay, so this figures is very interesting because we have an idea about to compare with a traditional stock market. You're talking about the systemic risk. we have witnessed, I mean, especially for the last, I don't know, maybe, because DeFi exists for several years now. I mean, in the HCC, we were always on the DeFi summer, maybe 3 years ago. So, but maybe what have recently changed, and we saw that with Celsius, with all these companies, that the DeFi product is more and more accessible to the people through maybe the VASP. What is your feeling about this? Because it's not really non-custodial anymore. I mean, the access to DeFi is becoming much more easy now. Maybe.
I'll just say one thing. If it's custodial, it's not DeFi. It is only if it is non-custodial, that is one of the hallmarks of making it DeFi. But if it's anything else, then it is CeFi, because there is a centralized actor taking control of people's assets.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think I've been kind of like dogmatic over that over the years. It's interesting. Recently, I've come to realize that I think there's kind of a stark realization we all have to make, which is that there's going to be a number of people that access these services through these centralized intermediaries. And I think, obviously, as we talk about regulation, that's often the first point that I'm turning to, which is to say, I think distinguishing between something like a protocol and an intermediary is one of the first threshold issues that you get to before you can start looking about, like sensible regulation. So in this case, I don't think, it's necessarily fatal for DeFi itself that there are going to be intermediaries, but I do think that there's a recognition that those are the on-ramps that are likely the most apt to target. Now, unfortunately, that's not necessarily the narrative that we have going with some of the regulators globally, but I do think we're starting to see some of that shift. We've seen MiCA in some ways, a softening with respect to unhosted wallets. We're starting to see, I wouldn't say capitulation, but at least some understanding in the States that if not an acceptance, an inevitability that you can either try to regulate effectively or you can try to regulate, philosophically and fail. And so I think as they're starting to come to that realization, these intermediaries are starting to become the appropriate targets there. And to be frank, I mean, with Celsius and everything else, it's probably the right target, at least from my perspective.
I agree.
I think the one thing I would just say is, lawyers, regulators are told copy and paste as the starting point for most people. You look at MiCA, it looks at traditional securities, it copy and pastes. Yes, it tweaks, but it copy and pastes. You look at the bridges is an intermediary. Intermediaries we love because they're something we're used to. We stick it in the middle and we get it to work. However, we don't want it to stop innovation and natural thinking. And one of my bugbears is for KYC and AML. That entire thought process is based on an old-fashioned world where you meet your client, you get given his password, you find all sorts of things you never realized you didn't want to know, like their age, where they were born, all things you just don't care about. All you want to know is, am I acting with Bin Laden or not? And if I'm not acting with Bin Laden, I am good to go. Now, if you take something like that and you take something like DeFi, you can create projects where someone has done all that paperwork, and all I need is a green, yellow, amber, whatever bloody color system you like. Can I go ahead or not is all I care about. The problem with the bridges is it is very much easy to come back and go, we need to bring these people in as an intermediary, and all you do is you shift all the old regulation from the DeFi protocol onto the bridge and go, the bridge is going to cure all. You make the bridge's life hell, and that's the way the things are currently moving. But it is not getting at the core point, which is there are better ways of doing some of the existing regulation, and those need to be thought through properly. And the big advantage and the excuse that DeFi gives us is the ability to properly rethink where we're at and find a way forward. And I'm not saying we don't have regulation. I'm not saying we don't do things compliantly. It's about, the obsession at the moment is, should crypto follow the existing financial services system? Flick it around. Are there things in the traditional financial services system which should follow solutions in crypto because there's better ways of doing things?
I was meeting with a French regulator yesterday afternoon, and we had a very nice discussion about DeFi, and it is what everyone is interested in, and people are slowly, especially regulators all over the world, are coming around to understanding that DeFi is different. But one of the things I said at the end was, I was like, just philosophically, do you really think the current banking system is as safe as we think it is, right? Like, because there are millions of things that can happen with cash outside of the current banking system that really undercut this whole concept of KYC and stuff like that. And so I do push a lot when I speak to regulators that digital identity is very different than KYC, but is a good proxy depending on what types of transactions you're engaging in and what you're doing.
So just a small story, just to terrify some of you. When I was in college, I actually worked in the back end of like a credit union right after Dodd-Frank passed, and like there was a big like KYC and AML push. And at the time, like I had no interest in crypto. I didn't think it would be relevant to my career. But I will say, past me was probably not like the California stoner you wanted, like observing all of your personal information and making decisions as to whether you might access your bank account. But sure enough, there's like 20-year-old me, a close friend of mine, Hector, two other people, and it was very stereotypical, like Southern California college kids. And it kind of shocked me years later thinking about it, where I'm like, wow, they really just let a bunch of 19 to 22-year-olds kind of look through not just Americans' information, but it's like all of the information that would pass through those electronic funds. And so I hope over the years it's gotten better. I still have an account at my credit union. But if not, there's probably another version of me still looking at a lot of our information. So it's one of those things where I think there's a lot of perception about what this edifice is achieving and then what's actually happening in reality. And there's like such a huge gap in practice that it's kind of insane that there is like this level of confidence from a number of regulators that believe that these are catching as much as they should. And obviously, like, it wasn't like we were all skiving off and did nothing. But again, like, it's a 19 to 20-year-old. Like, they're not going to catch all of these things that, you know, you're intending for them to catch there. So I think it's one of those other things that needs to be recognized as well.
That story highlights two things. One, this is why we need regulation for centralized actors. But in all honesty, you do need to regulate centralized actors because you have humans with subjective judgment, and your subjective judgment and mine may be different, and so they need to be honed into a central space when you're going to affect user funds, for sure. And then I had another funny point, but now I can't remember it.
I think the other, I don't know if do you want to move on to the question? Or, no, I mean, I think the other thing is kind of difference between could and should as well. I mean, the one I love is if you take Bitcoin, the origin of Bitcoin was, to some people at least, let's not get into, is an alternative to traditional fiat money. That is an act of treason. Everything moving on from the original Bitcoin, therefore, is the proceeds of crime. Everyone who's ever held a Bitcoin has committed a criminal offense, and everyone, therefore, who's ever touched, held, stored, or played with any Bitcoin should probably go to jail on that logic, because it's all from the original Genesis block, which you can prove was potentially a treasonous offense. So I asked the regulator once whether we're going to lock up everyone in the UK who'd ever held a Bitcoin, because I could be very busy suddenly one afternoon, and they looked at me blankly and told me just to be quiet and stop being a nuisance. And then, but we still talk about how many transactions you go back and all the rest of it. And then you look at cash. Now in the UK, and this is not probably the world's greatest advert for the UK, but in the UK, 80% of £20 notes have traces of cocaine on them. That means when you go and buy your Pret sandwich, you're probably holding something which at one point was involved in a drug deal. Do we therefore go to every £20 note, do a spectrum analysis, work out if it's got cocaine, and then lock up anyone who buys it with it? Because it is technically, again, the proceeds of crime. And that's where people look at you blankly when you start talking like that. But it's the huge differential between could and should. And what you have with DeFi and blockchain technology is far greater power to look back on transactions and to do things, far greater than we had in the old system with cash, where people had to physically turn up and look at stuff and give subjective views. And because you can do more doesn't necessarily mean you should, but it means you should think about what you should be doing just because you've got greater powers.
Let's maybe continue on the program. Before talking about if DeFi should be regulation and what level of regulation, maybe Rebecca, have you identified some risk that is maybe similar to the traditional financial one, and that can be, I don't know, and then can be drawn to a kind of regulation, or maybe you can explain us is the opposite. If maybe DeFi is just a technical software that should not be regulated. I don't know. What can you tell us about it?
So the question is really about the risks and benefits.
What is the risk that can allow some kind of regulation
Sure. So there are definitely risks. I'm not sure Yeah, the DeFi level, just in terms of how the technology works. So it does eliminate certain types of risks that we're used to in traditional financial transactions, like counterparty risk and the like. It definitely eliminates certain types of what types of risks does it bring, did you say? I mean, the real types of risks are security risks, right? So are there hacks? Are there different types of, I think probably the security ones are the greatest on a day-to-day basis, but there are also things that it brings that we all sort of know and talk about, like transparency, that I think is very different than in the traditional financial system. But I think, you don't have the counterparty. I'm just trying to think through the general risk. It's just the risk of loss and the inability potentially to, retrieve your funds when the time comes.
Yeah, I think definitely technical risks are something that we're cognizant of. One thing that I find interesting is that despite the fact that DeFi is ostensibly something that we're not supposed to have inherent trust in folks in, there is at least some initial period, perhaps it may be like some transitory period, where you've got a weird relationship with the initial developers where there's at least some semblance of trust for some systems. Now, like I think the best designed systems ideally, rid yourself of the need to kind of depend on that as soon as possible. But there is probably, like interestingly, there's been recent issues that I've been thinking about where it's like, if you've got audits or something out there, right, at least in that, like the first step, there is, the potential for like regular just human fraud. Like somebody could change code after an audit is done, and unless everybody suddenly becomes a coder, there is that level of trust. I think in some ways, looking at other appendages might end up being a more interesting question, like auditors and things like that. In general, right? Like I don't think auditors can be held responsible for like breaches of like code that they just maybe inadvertently didn't catch. But there probably is going to be a world where if we do want to see DeFi adopted at scale and almost take on an independent life of its own, then these other ancillary features, the auditors, on-chain accountants, on-chain sleuths, things like that, there's probably going to need to be some framework for them to operate. That doesn't necessarily mean I think it constrains DeFi, but a lot of times we're focused on like, do we regulate intermediaries or do we regulate devs? But there's probably other folks in the ecosystem that might actually be better if you wanted to give people assurance that they didn't essentially need regulation specific to the technology, but rather than the players. Because I think, again, auditors are probably the easiest example just on the top of my head. But if you really think about it, there's probably going to be a world where eventually people are going to say, okay, look, like an auditor intentionally missed a bug or intentionally didn't disclose something. There's no way that we can just be like, oh, it's cool. Like they just lied and committed fraud and everybody lost $30 billion. Otherwise, the system itself isn't really feasible without reintroducing trusted third parties, which would kind of undermine the purpose there. So that's been something I've been thinking about. I don't think there's a good answer right now or who those people are, but I do think probably thinking about a broader scope of people to involve in this type of framework might actually be more useful than just going to devs or just going to like the intermediaries that we normally think about.
Auditors is actually what I use all the time when I'm talking to regulators, is like the first way that we can think about ensuring that there's this safety and security in the system to the point of consumer protection that they're used to. So I agree on that.
I don't think Jimmy said, but I tend to put things in idiot terms. Just out of curiosity, anyone in the room, have you only bought shares in a company? Equity. Do you feel you know what a share in a company is? Nope. You don't own anything. You don't own anything in the company? Nope. It's not a right to dividend. Anyone else want to give? Nope, no governance. You can have non-voting shares. Shares don't give you governance. Right in the share, I'm afraid, is a right to a percentage of the proceeds on the liquidation of a company. That's right. If the company goes bust, you might get 7% of what's left in the company. Really exciting stuff. Not exactly what they lead for when they sell you your share plan when you speak to your financial advisors, but you get what you get. Now, everyone's buying and selling shares freely, not understanding a clue what they're talking about. Now we take DeFi. Now, DeFi versus shares. Let's go back to the 1880s when shares first came out. Shares no one understood them. What are they about? There's lots of scams. There's dishonesty. There's money disappearing. It's really ethereal. We can't touch it. Who on earth would buy shares? In fact, in the UK, they actually banned shares and made them illegal because they were just considered just really dodgy things, and we would go nowhere and it would destroy the country. Now we're putting shares to kids going, let's put in a junior ISA. DeFi is like shares were back in the day when you got the press. If you took the old press articles, you delete the word shares and you stuck in the word DeFi, you can't really tell the difference between the press then and the press now around this. The issue, therefore, fundamentally with DeFi at the moment is the fact it's very early stage, and we rely on, we're going to be an auditor. Great. Does the auditor know what they're doing? Who knows? If you see what I mean. I saw one auditor I thought was brilliant. Unfortunately, he called himself Gandalf, which is not great when we started talking to investors, but the quality was there, if you see what I mean. And so it's a question of trying to pick your right people. How do you make it come together? But bear in mind that shares have been around for 100 years, and still, if you take someone like Lehman Brothers, for example, if Lehman Brothers had held all of its assets on chain, Lehman Brothers didn't go bust because it ran out of money. All banks are intrinsically bust. I don't mean to debate the bad news people, but all banks are intrinsically bust. They just have the ability to move finances along with it, and that's how a bank works. If Lehman Brothers had held its money on chain, such as a regulator could have turned up and said, yep, Lehman Brothers can satisfy that, and that, it's only those two departments, those are the two you need to worry about. To my mind, it's an open question whether Lehman Brothers would still be here today because Lehman Brothers could have because the regulators could have stepped in and given people that confidence. That is the opportunity which things like DeFi give you, the ability to do things better than it was before. But the disadvantage of DeFi is the fact that it's so new, and therefore you're having to work out all the time where it's going, how it's going to work. And again, putting it in idiot terms, this is basically all I can cope with. You see DeFi a bit like a car. You drive cars. You probably don't know how to make a car from scratch, but you do know when there's smoke billing out the front engine. That's usually not a good sign. Where we need to get to a DeFi is getting people to the point where they can spot that. And also, and again, this goes back to its very nature, the other reason why it's so distinct for people at the moment is with most new innovation starts professional first, i.e. a small number of big institutions can access it and it gets let into retail. What DeFi is the massive game changer. It starts with retail, and the question is now whether it gets pushed just for a professional. And that's the other challenge here. It's not only trying to work out how it goes as it goes along, but you've started with the fact that by its very nature, anyone can use it. And therefore, the idea of testing a small group and opening up is not how it's working. It's happening the other way. And that's what causes fear among the regulators, because you're letting ordinary people in. So if you want to get DeFi to work, it's about getting the level of understanding when you know the engine's caught fire, acknowledging where its strengths and weaknesses are, trying to do what you can to make it work as solid as you can given what you've got, and then just accepting the fact that absolutely nothing in the entire world has ever been or ever will be absolutely 100% perfect, and that's not what you're going for. You just got to be slightly less dodgy than the other last thing we've just been dealing with, and the last dodgy thing we've been dealing with has all been all the CFI stuff.
Thank you, James. Maybe we will, because we are arriving at the end of this panel. We didn't talk, but that's perfect to have a legal track and not talk about the legal stuff. I hope the technical tracks talk a lot about the legal. Now, maybe a last word from you two, Collins and Rebecca. Do you expect regulation on DeFi? And maybe what is your view on the coming regulation? Even if, for instance, in Europe, MiCA do not target DeFi itself. So, and after I will ask you a piece of advice for the DeFi project to anticipate the regulation on to comply.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely going to be attempts. To be frank, I think the direction we'll see places go, may depend on some foundational principles. I think I've said this for a few years now. Despite the fact that the U.S. is definitely sometimes viewed as super draconian, and despite the fact that there may be confidence rattled in interpretations of the Constitution and the like, I do think generally between both parties right now, there are still a significant number of politicians that do have kind of a almost uniquely like American libertarian streak. And I think to see some of the legislation that's been proposed that would need to be effectuated to, I think, wrangle DeFi in the way that U.S. politicians expect, I don't think that will necessarily last certain appeals. So for things like that seek to constrain expression in ways that likely go against our First and Fourth Amendment, those I actually think I've got pretty decent confidence that those won't pass, at least in the form that they're currently contemplated. I do think that you're going to see a lot from, especially like the MSB, FinCEN type of thing, even to the extent it doesn't necessarily impact devs directly. I do think that there are a lot of like centralized players that, you know, rightly or wrongly, DeFi players are getting a little incestuous with, and it's becoming really important to them. So one big thing, for instance, is like, I don't know if it's big out here, but you know, there are a number of U.S. companies that are essentially using some businesses as licenses as a service. I think, you know, for those businesses that get targeted, that may end up impacting certain DeFi models. So those folks will have to start thinking about how to adjust to that. But otherwise, while I do think there's going to be a lot of legislation coming down the pipes, I'm actually starting to become pretty skeptical that we're going to see something significant before something like late 2023 or 2024, in part because of like U.S. political flows, but also because there's so many other macroeconomic things that people are now more enamored with, that by the time they do turn back to crypto, even if it's, you know, midway through 2023, you kind of get to like the same, like, hey, we've got like a year before we can process something. So I really did think, you know, if you asked me this 4 months ago, I'd probably say like it's imminent by the end of the year. At this point, it's pretty clear, at least in the States, I wouldn't expect something too major with our midterms and everything coming until at least like late next year. And being frank here, even with Micah and everything, I'm not sure it's going to translate to as much as I initially thought, you know, when it was first percolating in 2021 or 2022. I'll let Rebecca go before, you know, if we have time for advice to DeFi startups.
Yeah. So I generally agree with Collins. There are lots of attempts going on right now behind the scenes in the U.S. to regulate different parts of the crypto space in terms of when they will be enacted and when they will actually be operational that people have to comply with. I would agree is pretty far out. And Mika is not even going to be operational for people to comply with till 2024. Yeah, something like that. So, and look, they carved DeFi out of Mika, at least in name. And I do think DG FISMA believes that DeFi has been carved out, and they're going to do their report and make their recommendation. And I talked about this on Tuesday when I did my talk on DeFi regulation, but like, it's coming. I agree it's not imminent. It's not happening in 2022, but they are all regulators everywhere around the globe are trying to figure this out and where it works. And so I can give a piece of advice for like what to do as a project, but my piece of advice, if you want to keep building, is to be out there advocating and thinking of ways that you can continue to innovate while also making sure that there are appropriate consumer guardrails.
The one thing I would just say is all the regulators are looking at all the other regulators, and advertisements is the other thing which is going to become quite a big battleground. In the UK, they're going to start regulating advertising. We've just been working with the Mauritius FSC drafting their rules. They're also going to look at regulating advertising. That's going to be a core focus. So it's advertising, and regulators are looking at each other and working together. The FCA have announced it's going to work alongside US regulators. Micah's another one people are looking at. They are all watching each other. So if you see something somewhere, other people are looking at it.
Thank you very much for all this information. We have tried to talk a little bit about the legal stuff at the end, so congratulations. You can applaud them if you want. And if there is one or two questions, we will be. I'm sure you will be glad to answer some questions.
Oh yeah, sorry. Maybe I jumped the gun. So I wanted to, you guys didn't touch upon the possibility of doing some hybrid architecture with off-chain and on-chain components, right? I'm a big fan of RWAs, which is real-world assets. How do you see that playing out? Do you think that there are architectures where you can use Ricardian contracts, or maybe even something written on a smart contract where if it goes to the courts, it's found to be legal contract, right? So, and also like, yeah, when Ricardian contracts, right? This thing was invented in the 1950s, and I don't see any developers or founders implementing them. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and especially the off-chain, on-chain, bringing real estate into on-chain and stuff like that.
Yeah, so on the Ricardian thing, there actually is somebody working on this. I know Vinay Gupta at Materium, I think, was exploring this like way back in like 2017 or 2018. Now I know they've changed some, and I don't know, what he's been doing since kind of going off on people on Twitter. But I think that like you can still check it out, and they did have some good research there on RWAs. That's something I've been working on since like 2017 with a variety of people, whether it's with like securities, equities, like various types of like pipe deals, or like looking at assets themselves. I do think there's a world where I think crypto, or I shouldn't say crypto, but like Web3 tech will be used. I don't necessarily know if we'll still call it DeFi, and to be frank, I don't really know if it really matters that much. Like the nomenclature there probably matters a lot less, because to be frank, at least for another, I don't know, probably 30, 50, 100 years, there's going to be some real world nexus. I mean, one, it's in the name, obviously, real world assets, but there's a real world nexus where people want to have certain things tied to identity or tied to, recordation systems that aren't just inherently decentralized, right? Like you want, land, like plots of land to be mapped onto some traditional systems. So in that sense, yeah, I do think we'll start to see a lot of Web3 tech adopted there. I don't necessarily know if it's going to look like necessarily what Rune initially thought it might look like in Maker. I do think they're starting to get to a more realistic model that at least for now works on a hybrid basis. Long term, I know that's like not the ideal system. Like I know what they're working with, like Monetalis and everything else with some of the Maker forums. Like obviously that's not like an idealization, but I do think in terms of direction, that's probably closer than what I think a lot of people have promised early on, that were very, very premature in the types of systems that are actually possible today, just given the fact that there are like historical and practical limitations in our current legal systems that unfortunately you just can't architect around. And I mean things like weirdly wonky things like what's the rule against perpetuities and things that like you have to follow, where it's like you actually do have to go to like a Secretary of State or something, and they have to physically do something. There's just no way to architect around that like in a fully decentralized way.
Oh.
So,
I mean, from what we've seen today, what do you call them, Mark? Not real world assets, tangible assets or something like that? Off-chain assets. So that makes much more sense, because Mark, who works at Aave as well, says, no, crypto is a real world asset too. It's just not tangible. So, but in terms of off-chain assets, I think Colin's point is right. I mean, what we've seen today is Centrifuge is probably one of the biggest architects of these off-chain asset markets, and they have taken a centrifuge market and they have built it on top of Aave so that you can use these off-chain assets that have been tokenized as collateral to borrow and things like that. So I think whether we call it DeFi or not, I think these types of markets can be built on top, but precisely because of what Collins was saying, they're off-chain assets. There has to be a centralized intermediary somewhere, and so that's at least at the point where the regulation will intersect with that kind of stuff. But I do think we're going to see a serious proliferation of these real-world off-chain asset markets and much more tokenization of real-world assets, and not just things like securities and equities. But if we actually want to build out the system to include more people, then building out more tokenize. If we're going to tokenize more off-chain assets, we will be able to bring more people into the system.
So we're doing loads of stuff with off-chain assets. Look, English law works well here. The American stuff sounds quite complicated, but anyway, English law works well here because bluntly, when you buy a sweetie bar from a shop, you don't sign a contract there. If you see what I mean, you have certainty of intent, you need to have an agreement. The purpose of the documentation is apportion liability. The biggest issues around off-chain assets are twofold. One, proving it's actually there. That's not a legal question, but bluntly, does the thing actually exist? Is usually the first set of things, and that's where you'll have your custodian or your vault or your whatever. And then the second one is if you're going to give a return linked to the off-chain asset, that's where it gets slightly more complicated, because you do not want to fall under the definition of collective investment scheme. Just take a step back. You put a lump of gold in a vault, gold sits in vault, token represents gold, absolutely fine. That works for silver, that works for that kind of stuff. You take a property, do you maintain the property? When do you look after it? How do you market it? How do you run it? Those are all questions involving discretion. If you then have a return linked to that discretion, then you start to feel a lot like a fund very, very quickly. So real estate is going to be one of the last bastions to go in this. And this is nothing to do with blockchain, nothing to do with DeFi. This is simply the old laws and collective investment schemes, which are broad, and they've been capturing things like farms and these sorts of models for a long time. So if you stick with assets which are kind of physical, they just sit there, the short answer is it works.
I'm sorry, we are running out of time if you have any question, but maybe if you want to ask them other question, you will be there this morning. Okay, great. So thank you very much for your participation, and we're moving forward with Romain from Paladin. Thank you, everyone.